Listen carefully, because there are sounds in this world that were never meant to be heard twice. Most people believe history is written in ink, in records, in dusty courthouse ledgers and yellowed newspapers. But men who have spent enough time studying the darker corridors of the past understand something else entirely. History is written in silence, in the things people refuse to investigate, in the questions no one dared ask, and sometimes in the sound of a bell. On a Tuesday evening in October of 1872, in a forgotten settlement buried deep in the swamps of Louisiana, a church bell rang 12 times. Not for a funeral, not for a gathering, not for a warning. 12 slow strikes, spaced far enough apart that every man, woman, and child in the settlement could count them. 1, 2, 3. Each toll sinking into the warm southern air like a stone into black water. And here is the detail that still unsettles historians who stumble across the record more than a century later. No one was pulling the rope. The church was empty. No wind, no storm, no one in the bell tower. Yet the bell rang anyway, 12 times. That same night, 3 miles south of the church, the most powerful plantation family in the entire parish sat down for supper in their large white house overlooking the bayou. 7 people at the table: a wealthy patriarch who once commanded men in war, his careful wife who understood power better than most men, their 4 children, and an elderly aunt whose influence in the parish stretched back decades. They began eating just after dusk. By morning, every one of them was gone. No blood, no signs of struggle, no horses missing from the stable. Their dinner plates still on the table, wine still in their glasses, candles burned nearly to the bottom, and the patriarch's chair overturned, as if he had stood up very suddenly. 7 members of the Vulcan family vanished. But the strangest detail wasn't that they disappeared. The strangest detail, the thing that should make every man listening right now pause, is what happened next. Because the sheriff arrived, the parish judge reviewed the evidence, neighbors were questioned, and after 11 weeks, the investigation quietly stopped. No suspects, no search parties, no real answers. Just a single line written into the official record. Cause undetermined. But men who understand power understand something else. When powerful people vanish and no one seems eager to find them, that isn't mystery, that's control. Tonight, we descend into one of the strangest disappearances in American history, a story about debt, revenge, hidden records, and a secret that may explain why that bell rang 12 times, exactly when it needed to. But before we go deeper, understand this. Once you see how this event actually fits together, once you understand the forces that were moving beneath the surface of that quiet Louisiana parish, you will never hear a church bell the same way again. Because sometimes a bell doesn't call people to prayer. Sometimes it announces that justice has arrived, and someone is about to lose everything.
7 years after the Civil War ended, the American South looked calm from a distance. Fields were planted again, churches reopened. Men tipped their hats on dusty roads like nothing had changed. But men who truly study history understand something most textbooks avoid saying out loud. Peace is often just violence that hasn't decided where to land next. And in 1872, the land around Harrow Bluff, Louisiana, was heavy with unfinished business. Harrow Bluff itself was barely a town, a narrow ridge of slightly higher ground surrounded by miles of swamp and slow-moving bayou water. Cypress trees leaned over black channels of mud and roots. Mosquitoes ruled the air like a permanent occupation force. The place didn't appear on most maps, but everyone within 40 miles knew it. There was a general store run by a cautious man named Elias Fontenot, a blacksmith shop with a roof patched more times than anyone could count, a schoolhouse staffed by a northern teacher nobody fully trusted, and standing at the western edge of the settlement, Calvary Road Baptist Church, a tall white wooden building with a narrow steeple that could be seen rising above the cypress fog every morning. The church had one bell, heavy, bronze, imported decades earlier from a foundry in Baltimore. It rang exactly twice a day, 7 in the morning, noon at midday, never at night, never 12 times. People in Harrow Bluff lived by those sounds. Farmers, laborers, traders. The rhythm of the bell told you when work began and when the sun had climbed high enough to break for food. Men built habits around it. Children grew up hearing it. Which is why when that bell rang 12 times on a Tuesday evening, every person in Harrow Bluff noticed. But to understand why that sound mattered, you need to understand the family living 3 miles south of town. Because the Valken Plantation wasn't just another farm, it was power. The land had belonged to the Valken family since before the Louisiana Purchase, before the United States even existed in its current form. Generations of Valkens had owned that property, survived epidemics, survived floods, survived wars, and most importantly, survived the collapse of the old Southern order. At the center of it all stood the current patriarch, Edward Valken, 53 years old in the fall of 1872, a man who had once worn the uniform of a Confederate colonel, a man who commanded soldiers, and before that, commanded slaves. He had returned to the war to find his world changed in ways he never truly accepted. The labor system that made his wealth possible was gone. The economy had turned unstable. Debt crept in quietly. But Edward Valken was not the kind of man who admitted weakness. Men like him rarely do. Instead, he adapted the way many plantation owners did in those years, by building systems that looked legal on paper while quietly keeping control over the same people who had once been enslaved. Contracts, debt ledgers, charges for housing, charges for food, charges for tools, workers who could never quite pay off what they owed, freedom, technically, dependence, practically. And here's the uncomfortable truth buried inside this story. Many people in Harrow Bluff understood exactly how the Valken Plantation operated. They simply didn't say it out loud, because power in small places works differently than power in cities. In a city, corruption hides behind paperwork. In a small parish, it hides behind silence. And the Valken family had benefited from that silence for decades. Which is why what happened next, what happened on that October evening, becomes even more interesting. Because when powerful families disappear overnight, the first question most men ask is, who did this? But that's the wrong question. The correct question is the one historians eventually learn to ask. Not who did it, but who allowed it. And in Harrow Bluff, there were far more people who might have allowed the Valken family to vanish than anyone at the time was willing to admit. Because buried beneath that quiet parish, beneath the church and the farms and the polite greetings, there was something else growing: resentment, memory, and patience. The kind of patience that waits years, sometimes decades, before settling a debt. And when the church bell rang 12 times that Tuesday evening, some men in Harrow Bluff later admitted something strange. They didn't feel confused. They didn't feel afraid. They felt something else, something colder, something quieter, something that sounded almost like recognition, as if somewhere deep in their bones they already knew what that bell meant. And if that instinct was correct, then the disappearance of the Valken family wasn't a random mystery. It was a message, and someone had just announced it to the entire parish.
Powerful families rarely fall all at once. They rot slowly from the inside. By the autumn of 1872, the Valken plantation still looked strong to anyone passing on the muddy road that led south from Harrow Bluff. The main house stood tall, white wood siding, broad porch, high windows catching the late Louisiana sun. But appearances are the favorite disguises of collapsing empires. Inside that house, pressure had been building for months, maybe longer. Edward Valken still carried himself like a man who believed the old world would eventually return. The war, to him, had been an interruption, not an ending. He spoke less than he once had, but when he did, his voice carried the same quiet command that had once ordered soldiers into battle. Yet men like Edward often misunderstand something critical. Authority built on fear works perfectly, until the moment people stop fearing you. And by 1872, fear had begun slipping through his fingers. His wife, Henriette, noticed it first. Women who live beside powerful men often become experts at reading invisible signals, the tightening of a jaw, the restless pacing after dark, the way letters are folded too quickly and pushed into desk drawers. Henriette Valken had learned long ago that survival required observation. She rarely raised her voice, rarely challenged her husband, but she watched, always watched. That summer she noticed the letters. They arrived from New Orleans, thin envelopes, sometimes 2 in the same week. Edward would read them in his study, then burn them in the fireplace before anyone else entered the room. That alone would not have been strange. Plantation owners dealt with business constantly. But there was something different about these, something that changed the air inside the house. Their eldest son, Theodore, felt it too. At 26, Theodore was a man already known throughout the parish for possessing 2 dangerous qualities: his father's temper and his father's pride. But he lacked the older man's restraint. Where Edward hid anger behind silence, Theodore carried it openly. And that summer, he traveled to New Orleans. Officially, it was a business trip, something about financial arrangements with a creditor. Unofficially, something else happened there, something that followed him home like a storm cloud. August remembered the day Theodore returned. August was the 8th person tied to the Valken household. Not family, not exactly servant either. Before the war, he had been enslaved on the property. After emancipation, he remained, one of those strange post-war arrangements where a man's freedom existed on paper, but his life stayed tied to the same land. August was 44 years old, tall, quiet, the kind of man people forgot was standing nearby, which made him extremely dangerous to secrets, because men who speak little hear everything. And that afternoon in July 1872, August heard something that would echo through the rest of his life. Theodore found his father in the stable. They believed themselves alone, but August was in the adjoining shed repairing tools. Their voices carried through the wooden boards. At first, it sounded like an ordinary argument, but then Theodore said something that froze August where he stood. "You sold a man who was not yours to sell." The words cut through the stable like a knife. Silence followed, a long silence. Then Edward's voice came back, calm, almost too calm. "That is not what happened." Theodore laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Then tell me what happened," he said. "Tell me where he went. Tell me what you did with the money." The stable door slammed soon after, and Theodore walked past August without looking at him. But August had already heard enough, because those words carried a meaning deeper than most men listening today might realize. In the decades before the Civil War, enslaved people were bought and sold constantly. But there was one rule even slave traders understood. You could not legally sell a free man, not without destroying the evidence first. And if Theodore had discovered proof that his father had done exactly that, then the Valken family was no longer just a powerful plantation dynasty. They were something else entirely. A house built on fraud, on stolen freedom, on a crime that, if exposed in the fragile legal climate of Reconstruction America, could destroy everything they had left. And if that truth had finally resurfaced in New Orleans, then someone else knew it too. Which means the letters arriving at the Valken house that summer were not business correspondence. They were warnings, or demands, or both. And when men who have lived their entire lives protected by silence suddenly realize their secrets are no longer safe, they begin making desperate decisions. But here's the part most people miss when they study this story. Theodore's anger was not directed at the man who had discovered the secret. It was directed at his father, which means something important had already changed inside the Valken family. The fracture had begun, and once cracks appear inside a powerful house, the collapse rarely comes from outside. It comes from within. 3 months later, the church bell rang 12 times, and the Valken family disappeared. But the real story of that night was already unfolding long before the bell ever rang.
There is a dangerous illusion most people carry about power. They believe powerful families control the story. But men who study the darker layers of history eventually realize something else. The real story is often carried by the people no one bothers to question. In Harrow Bluff, that man was August. You must understand what August represented in that world. He had lived on the Valken land before the war, during the war, and after the war. He had watched masters become debtors, watched slaves become workers, watched laws change while habits refused to. He had spent decades in rooms where men spoke freely because they assumed he was invisible. And invisible men collect truths. Truths that never appear in official records. Truths that powerful people pray will stay buried. August was known throughout the parish as a man who remembered everything. Not in the loud, boastful way some men claim memory, but in the quiet way of someone who simply notices. Who said what, who owed what, who disappeared, who came back. So when October 14th arrived, August was already carrying months of tension in his mind. That Tuesday evening began like hundreds before it. The sky over the bayou turned the deep amber color that only southern autumn produces. The air grew thick with the buzzing machinery of insects rising from the cypress roots. Inside the Valken house, supper was prepared. Henriette oversaw the meal with the same precision she used every evening. Sweet potatoes, bread, wine. The family gathered around the dining table shortly after dusk. 7 seats filled, Edouard at the head, Theodore beside him, the daughters Adele and Margot speaking quietly, young Leon mostly silent, watching the adults the way children do when something unspoken hangs in the air, and Aunt Celeste, the oldest member of the household, whose sharp eyes had witnessed the rise and decline of half the parish's great families. Outside, 40 yards behind the house, August sat in his small cabin. He could see the glow of the dining room candles through the windows. He could hear faint voices when the wind shifted. Everything appeared normal. Then the church bell rang. 1. The sound carried across the swamp like a slow ripple. August froze. 2. 3. By the 4th toll he had stepped outside. 5. 6. The bell was coming from Calvary Road Church, 3 miles north. 7. But something about the rhythm was wrong. 8. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't panicked. 9. The strikes came slowly, deliberately, like someone measuring time. 10. August counted every one. 11. Then the 12th strike echoed across the water and faded into silence. The insects resumed their endless noise. Nothing else moved. Inside the Vulcan house, the candles still burned. August stood there for a few minutes watching the windows, waiting for something unusual, a lantern moving, a shout, a door slamming, but nothing happened. Eventually, he returned inside and went to sleep. That detail matters, because if something violent had occurred inside the house that night, August would have heard it. The swamp carries sound in strange ways. A horse's hooves half a mile away, a man shouting across water, even a slammed door can travel farther than you'd expect. But August heard nothing. No gunshots, no screams, no rushing footsteps, just the bell, and then silence. The next morning he walked to the main house, as he did every day. What he found inside would puzzle investigators for decades. The dining room looked frozen in time. 7 plates on the table, food half-eaten, 3 wine glasses partially filled, the serving dish still covered, and Edouard Vulcan's chair lying on its back, not shattered, not broken, just tipped over, as if a man had stood up too quickly. The candles had burned down almost to nothing, which meant they had been left burning for hours. August moved through the house room by room, bedrooms, kitchen, study. Everywhere the same story. Life paused, objects exactly where they had been left. Margot's hairbrush on her dresser, a letter sitting unfinished on Adele's writing desk, Aunt Celeste's reading glasses resting neatly on top of her open Bible. 7 people, gone, without coats, without horses, without any sign of struggle. But there was one more detail, one detail that never appeared in the sheriff's official report. In the narrow hallway behind the dining room, scratched into the plaster wall, were 7 marks, rough, uneven, like someone had carved them quickly with a knife. 7 vertical lines. At first glance they looked meaningless, but when the school teacher Graves later tried to interpret them, he noticed something strange. The spacing, the pattern, the way the final marks curved slightly. He stared at them for 3 full minutes before saying something that made the sheriff uncomfortable. They look like numbers. Not the number 7, something else, something longer, something that resembled 12. But before anyone could study the marks more closely, the sheriff returned 2 days later and claimed something curious. The plaster had crumbled. The scratches were gone. No photographs existed. No sketches entered the official record. Just a fading note in Graves' personal journal. 7 marks, possibly representing 12. A strange contradiction. But contradictions are often the fingerprints of truth. Because the deeper this story goes, the more it begins to look less like a disappearance and more like a carefully orchestrated exit. And if that's true, then the most important question isn't who took the Vulcan family. The real question is something far more unsettling. Why did no one in Harrow Bluff seem very interested in bringing them back? And if you listen closely to the patterns of history, you'll start to notice something strange. Sometimes the most dangerous revolutions don't happen in public squares. They happen quietly, without gunfire, without witnesses, without headlines. Just a bell ringing in the distance, and powerful men quietly walking away from everything they once controlled. When authorities investigate a disappearance, there are two paths they can take. The first path is truth. The second path is theater. What happened in Harrow Bluff in the weeks after the Vulcan family vanished was not truth. It was theater. The parish sheriff arrived 2 days after August reported the disappearance. His name was Arsenault, a man who had managed to keep his position before the Civil War, during the war, and through the chaos of Reconstruction. That alone told you something about him. Men who survive political storms rarely do so by chasing uncomfortable truths. They survive by knowing which questions not to ask. Arsenault walked through the Vulcan house slowly, carefully inspecting each room, while 2 deputies followed behind him, taking notes that would later become part of the official record. 7 plates, 7 chairs, 1 overturned. Candles burned low, windows intact. No broken locks, no footprints that made sense. He examined the stable. All 4 horses still there, which meant the family had not left by carriage. He checked the nearby road. Nothing. No wagon tracks. No sign of hurried travel. Then he questioned August. The official transcript of that conversation still exists in fragments. It is short, almost suspiciously short. August told him exactly what he had told everyone else. He heard the bell. He saw candlelight in the dining room. He heard nothing during the night. He found the house empty in the morning. Arsenault wrote everything down, but he never asked the most important questions. He never asked about the argument between Theodore and his father. He never asked about the letters from New Orleans. He never asked why the Vulcan family had been under growing financial pressure, and most telling of all, he never asked August about the 7 marks scratched into the hallway wall. When the schoolteacher Graves mentioned them, Arsenault dismissed the detail almost immediately. "Old plaster cracks easily," he said. "Nothing reliable about markings like that." And just like that, the only physical clue inside the house disappeared from the investigation. But the real performance was only beginning. Over the next 11 weeks, Arsenault conducted what appeared to be a thorough search. He questioned nearby plantation owners. He questioned traders. He even sent a deputy north toward Baton Rouge, asking if any members of the Vulcan family had been seen traveling. Every answer came back the same. Nothing. No sightings, no bodies, no rumors of violence. The official conclusion slowly began forming behind closed doors. Perhaps the family had fled their debts. Perhaps they had moved west quietly. Perhaps bandits had intercepted them somewhere in the swamp. Each explanation sounded plausible enough to satisfy people who preferred comfortable answers. But there was a problem. One detail refused to fit: the bell, because the bell changed everything. It fixed the exact time of the event. Every person in Harrow Bluff could tell investigators precisely when the evening had turned strange. Around 7 o'clock, the bell rang 12 times. And if the bell marked the beginning of whatever happened, then the disappearance occurred within a narrow window, which means someone knew exactly when it would happen. The bell was not random. It was a signal, and signals only exist for one reason: someone is meant to hear them. Now here is where the story becomes far more interesting, because while Arsenault was performing his investigation in public, something else was happening quietly behind the scenes. The Vulcan plantation had creditors, serious creditors. Banks in New Orleans had extended large loans to plantation owners during the war, expecting to recover their money once the Southern economy stabilized. But Reconstruction had made that recovery uncertain, and Edouard Vulcan owed more than most people realized. Within 4 months of the family's disappearance, representatives from one of those banks arrived in the parish courthouse. They filed legal paperwork placing the Vulcan estate into receivership. The land, the house, everything, seized, sold, redistributed, just like that. No missing persons case reopened, no aggressive search ordered, no extended investigation. The powerful Vulcan family vanished, and the financial system moved on without hesitation. Which raises a question very few historians ask. How many people benefited from the Vulcan disappearance? The answer is uncomfortable. Creditors recovered land, neighboring plantations expanded territory, workers on the Vulcan fields quietly dispersed, free from contracts that had kept them trapped in endless debt, and the sheriff avoided a complicated legal disaster that could have exposed crimes stretching back decades. In other words, almost everyone gained something. Which leads to one of the oldest truths about human systems. When a crime benefits too many people, it stops looking like a crime. It starts looking like an adjustment. And Harrow Bluff adjusted quickly. By January of 1873, the official investigation was closed. One sentence in the parish ledger sealed the matter. Cause undetermined. But there was one man in town who did not accept that answer, the northern schoolteacher, Graves, because men who spend their lives studying patterns eventually notice something others ignore, the details that disappear too quickly, the questions no one writes down, the witnesses who are never called back. Graves kept a journal, a personal record of everything he saw and heard in Harrow Bluff, and on the night the investigation ended, he wrote a sentence that would sit unnoticed in an Ohio library for nearly 60 years, a sentence that suggested something far more deliberate had happened on that October night. He wrote, "Everyone is pretending this was confusion, but confusion does not ring a church bell 12 times."
There is a moment in every investigation when the official story begins to separate from the real one. Most men never notice that moment. They accept the paperwork, the signatures, the stamped conclusions, and they move on with their lives. But a few people possess a different instinct. They notice the gaps, the missing lines, the things that were almost written down and then erased. In Harrow Bluff, that man was the schoolteacher, Graves. He was an outsider, which in a place like Louisiana in 1872 meant he already existed on the edge of trust, a northerner sent south during Reconstruction to help rebuild the education system. Locals tolerated him. They spoke politely when necessary, but they did not invite him into their circles, which, ironically, made him the perfect observer. Because when people believe you are irrelevant, they stop hiding things. Graves had heard the church bell that night like everyone else. He had walked to the church himself 15 minutes after the final toll. The door had been unlocked, the sanctuary empty, the rope hanging perfectly still, and the dust beneath the bell tower undisturbed, not a single fresh footprint. At the time, he assumed it was some strange accident, a loose mechanism perhaps. But when the Vulcan family vanished hours later, the memory began to trouble him. So he did something few others bothered to do. He started writing everything down. Not just facts, patterns, conversations, expressions on people's faces when certain subjects were mentioned. He recorded the sheriff's behavior, the rushed tone of the investigation, the way certain questions were avoided. But most importantly, he recorded August. Because while the official report treated August like a minor witness, Graves saw something different. He saw a man who knew more than he was saying, not because August was hiding something malicious, but because August understood something Graves was only beginning to grasp. In places ruled by power, truth is a currency, and giving it to the wrong person can destroy lives. Several days after the investigation began, Graves approached August privately behind the old Vulcan property. The house already felt strange, empty, like a body after the soul had left. Graves asked him a simple question. "Did you notice anything unusual in the months before the family disappeared?" August was quiet for a long time.
the kind of silence that forces another man to examine his own motives. Finally, he said three sentences that Graves wrote into his journal word for word. "I knew something was wrong 3 months before they vanished. I knew it when I found the letters, and I knew it when Theodore came back from New Orleans and wouldn't look at his father." Graves had the hairs on his neck rise. "What letters?" he asked. August studied him carefully. Then he said something that would echo in Graves' mind for decades. The kind that get burned before the wrong person reads them. And that was all. August walked away after that. No elaboration, no explanation, just the quiet confidence of a man who had seen enough history to recognize when the past had finally caught up with someone. For the next several weeks, Graves kept investigating on his own, not officially, just quietly asking questions. He discovered something curious. The Valken Plantation had been visited earlier that year by a representative from the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency created after the Civil War to monitor the treatment of newly freed black workers in the South. The Bureau agent's name was Whitfield, and his report described the Valken labor system using a phrase that would have made Edward Valken deeply uncomfortable: informal bondage maintained through economic coercion. In plain language, the workers were technically free, but trapped by debt, food charges, housing charges, tool charges, a system designed so that the balance never quite reached zero. Modern historians would call it debt peonage. Whitfield recommended federal action, an investigation, possible legal consequences. But 6 weeks later, something interesting happened. Whitfield was reassigned to Arkansas. His report disappeared into a federal archive, and nothing further happened. Graves wrote all of this down. Then he uncovered another thread: the bank in New Orleans, the one holding the Valken mortgage. Letters had been exchanged between Edward Valken and a creditor named Delacroix. Delacroix had sent a representative to Harrow Bluff in September of 1872, 3 weeks before the disappearance. No one knew what had been discussed during that meeting, but Graves knew enough about pressure to recognize the pattern. Legal pressure from the Freedmen's Bureau, financial pressure from creditors, and personal pressure from whatever Theodore had discovered in New Orleans. The Valken family was surrounded, which meant the disappearance could not be random. It had to be connected to something larger. But there was still one missing piece: the letters August mentioned, because letters leave trails, and trails lead to people. The more Graves thought about it, the more one possibility began forming in his mind. What if the letters had come from someone the Valken family believed was gone forever? Someone's life had been destroyed years earlier by something Edward Valken had done, something illegal, something unforgivable. If that person had returned in 1872 with proof, with allies, and with the patience of a man who had seen enough history to recognize when the past had finally caught up with someone, then the bell ringing 12 times that night might not have been a warning. It might have been a signal that a long-delayed reckoning had finally arrived. And if that was true, then the disappearance of the Valken family wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the end of one, and the quiet start of another. But to understand that possibility, we have to talk about a man whose name barely survived the historical record: a carpenter, a free man, a man who should never have been sold, a man who may have spent 14 years preparing for the night when the bell finally rang. His name was Thomas Dufresne. And once you understand what happened to him, the events in Harrow Bluff begin to look less like a mystery and more like a settlement.
The deeper you dig into forgotten stories, the more you realize something unsettling. History rarely forgets accidents. It forgets embarrassments. And in the dusty parish records of southern Louisiana, the name Thomas Dufresne appears exactly 3 times, once in a tax ledger, once in a church baptism entry, and once in a shipping manifest. That third record is where the story becomes disturbing. Thomas Dufresne was not born enslaved. He was a free black carpenter living in southern Louisiana in the 1850s. He repaired barns, built furniture, and occasionally worked on plantation structures when extra hands were needed. Men like him occupied a strange space in pre-Civil War society, technically free, but always one accusation, one dishonest contract, or one powerful enemy away from losing everything. And in 1858, Thomas Dufresne made a mistake that would eventually echo across 14 years of history. He took a large job. The Vulcan plantation needed repairs after a storm damaged several buildings. Edward Vulcan hired Dufresne to rebuild the carriage house and reinforce part of the main structure. For 3 months, Dufresne worked on the property. He was paid partially in cash, partially in credit, and partially in written promise. Those promises were recorded in a contract signed by Edward Vulcan himself. At least, that's what the record originally said. But contracts are fragile things in places where power outweighs law. Because 2 months after that work ended, Thomas Dufresne disappeared. At first, no one thought much about it. Travelers came and went constantly. But weeks later, something strange surfaced in a New Orleans shipping ledger. A manifest listing enslaved individuals being transported to a sugar plantation in Cuba. Among the names was Thomas Dufresne. That alone should have been impossible. You cannot legally sell a free man. But the document existed, which meant someone had done exactly that. Someone had falsified ownership. Someone had created paperwork claiming Thomas Dufresne was property, and someone had made money from it. When Graves eventually uncovered this detail years later, he sat with the record for nearly an hour, because suddenly Theodore Vulcan's angry words in the stable made perfect sense. You sold a man who was not yours to sell. That was the crime. A free man turned into property on paper, sold into slavery in another country, and the profits quietly absorbed into the Vulcan family's wealth. But here is where the story becomes almost unbelievable, because Thomas Dufresne did not disappear forever. 14 years later, in 1872, a man matching his description returned to Louisiana. Tall, broad shoulders, left hand missing 2 fingers. That detail mattered. The shipping manifest from 1858 included a small note describing the enslaved carpenter as missing 2 digits on the left hand. It was almost certainly the same man. But how did he survive? Records suggest Dufresne was sent to a brutal Cuban sugar estate where enslaved laborers rarely lived long. Sugar plantations were some of the harshest environments in the Atlantic world. Yet somehow he endured. And sometime in the late 1860s, after the collapse of slavery systems across the Americas, he made his way back to the United States. Imagine what that journey must have looked like. 14 years. 14 years of forced labor. 14 years knowing exactly who had destroyed your life. Men have crossed oceans for less. But Dufresne didn't return loudly. He didn't march into a courthouse. He didn't confront Edward Vulcan publicly. Instead, he disappeared into the background, just like August, just like the quiet men history overlooks. And sometime in the summer of 1872, he began writing letters. Letters sent to the Vulcan house. Letters that arrived from New Orleans. Letters that Edward Vulcan burned immediately after reading. What was written in them? No one knows the exact words,
But Graves later speculated in the tone in his journal. He wrote, "The letters were not threats, they were reminders." Imagine opening one of those envelopes. Imagine seeing the handwriting of a man you believed dead, a man whose freedom you sold, a man whose life you destroyed for profit. And now he's back, not shouting, not begging, just reminding you that he exists. That kind of quiet pressure is more terrifying than violence, because it leaves you wondering what comes next. Maybe that is why Theodore went to New Orleans. Maybe he tried to find Dufresne. Maybe he tried to pay him off, or threaten him, or silence him. But whatever happened in that city, Theodore came home angry. And 3 months later, the bell rang 12 times, and the Vulcan family vanished. Which leaves us with a haunting possibility. What if Thomas Dufresne didn't come back for revenge? What if he came back for something far simpler? Justice. But justice, especially in places where the law once protected powerful men like Edward Vulcan, rarely arrives through official channels. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the dark, with no witnesses, no paperwork, no investigation, just a signal echoing through the swamp. A church bell, 12 slow strikes, and the understanding that after 14 years, a debt was finally being collected. But there is still one final piece of this story that makes historians pause. Because after the disappearance, after the estate was seized, after Harrow Bluff moved on, a traveler passing through the region reported seeing something strange near the abandoned Plantation Road. 2 men walking south through the swamp, one older, one younger. The older man carried a small carpenter's tool bag, and the younger man walked beside him with a limp. They did not look like fugitives. They looked like men leaving a job, finally finished. And if that sighting was real, then somewhere in the deep Louisiana wetlands that night, 2 men walked away from the ruins of a powerful family, one who had once lost everything, and one who had spent years quietly waiting for the right moment to help him take it back. And the bell? The bell may simply have been the announcement, not of a crime, but of a reckoning, the kind history almost never records, but never truly forgets.
Stories like this rarely end with certainty. They end with fragments, loose threads, and one final detail that refuses to sit quietly. For nearly 60 years after the Vulcan disappearance, Harrow Bluff slowly faded. The plantation system collapsed. Families moved away. The church aged. The bell tower leaned slightly to one side as storms and time worked together. By the early 1900s, very few people still remembered the night the bell rang 12 times. But records have a strange habit of resurfacing. In 1931, a historian cataloging old parish documents discovered Graves' private journal in a small Ohio archive. The schoolteacher had returned north decades earlier and left behind boxes of notes from his time in Louisiana. Most of it was ordinary, lists of crops, weather patterns, school attendance. But one section stood out, a long entry written almost 10 years after the Vulcan disappearance. In that entry, Graves described a meeting that had never appeared in any official account. It happened in the spring of 1881, 9 years after the night of the bell. Graves had been traveling through New Orleans when he stopped at a small carpentry shop near the docks. He needed a crate repaired before shipping books back north. The shop owner was an older black man, broad shoulders, 2 missing fingers on his left hand. Graves recognized him instantly. Thomas Dufresne. The moment stretched between them for several seconds. Neither man spoke. Finally, Graves asked the only question that had haunted him for nearly a decade. Did you ring the bell? According to the journal, Dufresne smiled. Not proudly, not angrily, just the faint smile of a man who had already closed a chapter of his life. Then he said something that Graves wrote down carefully, something historians still debate today. Dufresne said, "The bell was not for them." Graves waited, but the carpenter only returned to his work. After a moment, he added one more sentence. It was for the man they thought they had buried. And that was the end of the conversation. Graves left the shop with his repaired crate and never saw Dufresne again. That final statement is the piece of the puzzle that changes how some historians interpret the entire story. Because if the bell was not meant for the Valken family, then it was meant for someone else, someone waiting, someone who needed to know the moment had arrived. And that brings us back to the most overlooked man in this entire story. August, the quiet worker who heard the bell, the man who lived on the property, the man who told Graves he knew something was wrong months before the disappearance. If the bell was a signal, then August may have been the one meant to hear it, which means the plan may have been larger than one man seeking revenge. It may have been something far more deliberate, a quiet collaboration, two men whose lives had been shaped by the same injustice, one who had been illegally sold, one who had lived decades under the shadow of the same family, both waiting for the same moment. And when that moment came, the bell rang 12 times. Not a warning, not a prayer, a signal that a long debt had finally come due. After that night, the Valken family was never seen again. No graves, no bodies, no confirmed sightings, just an empty house and a parish that seemed strangely comfortable letting the mystery remain unsolved. Which leads to one final thought that Graves wrote in the margin of his journal, a thought historians still quote when discussing Harrow Bluff. He wrote, "Justice does not always arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it arrives quietly and leaves before anyone decides to call it a crime." And somewhere deep in Louisiana, long after the church itself collapsed, that old bronze bell was reportedly found half buried in swamp mud, cracked down one side, as if it had rung far harder than it was ever meant to. 12 times. Exactly 12.